What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York, and on the phone we got Joel from Witchskull. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Yep. So the newest album is A Driftwood Cross, and I know that you just released a video and a single for This Silent Place. Could that almost serve as a clear representation of what the whole album is going to sound like, or was that just kind of like the first taste of it in a way?
I think it's more the first taste. The rest of the album is probably a little more straight ahead metal, I reckon. Yeah, This Silent Place is a bit of an unusual song. We weren't 100% sure it was even going to make the record. It was the last song we wrote before we went into the studio, and as we built it up, as the session went on, it ended up being one of the songs that we decided we were going to put on it. But yeah, didn't expect it to be the first song released.
Oh, really? Interesting. So was there kind of like a preconceived idea of what you wanted A Driftwood Cross to sound like, or was there kind of like a lot of improvising involved?
Look, we've been writing the album pretty much as soon as the last record finished. We're in an unusual situation being in Australia that it's a lot harder to tour from out here. And because our profile, was on the last album probably wasn't big enough to start touring overseas, we sort of spent most of our time, as soon as the last album came out, we just started writing. And we just sort of focused on trying to make the songs stronger than the last album was the main sort, thing that we all spoke about. And luckily, I think we've done that. I think all of the songs, Marcus did a much better job, I think, on his melodies and the delivery of his vocals. Not that they were bad before, but I just think he really excelled on this one. And we just spent a lot of time arranging and just letting the songs kind of breathe. So you were really happy with the results.
Interesting. One thing I was curious about is that I thought this record was fairly, I don't want to say experimental, because that just makes it sound like you're doing smooth jazz on one song and then grindcore on the next. But I thought that there was a lot of different elements. It's fair to say you guys were taking inspiration from multiple sources for this album, right?
Yeah, I think our stuff, we tend to, when we write, it comes from sort of jamming. So someone will bring in a riff, mostly Marcus, but Tony writes some great riffs as well, and I throw the odd one in, and we just sort of build on that riff and let the songs kind of evolve naturally. It's not like people bring entire sort of songs to the rehearsal space and then we work them up. So what we try and do is have cohesion through a record, and just draw on all of the influences that the three of us kind of like. We've got similar tastes because we're the same age, so we just draw on all the influences that are important to all three of us when we were growing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love what I read on the description for you guys, that you consider this more of a brotherhood than a band. I love that description.
Yeah, well, it's like that. Like, as I was mentioning to you earlier, Tony, our bass player, is from New York. He's from Queens. So he married an Australian girl called Caroline, and that's Marcus's cousin. So when Tony moved from New York City to Canberra, which is that's a big move, the only person he knew was Marcus. So they sort of hit it off straight away because they're just big, Hendrix and Sabbath fans, and Priest and all of that sort of stuff. So once they got together, I was living in another city in Australia, but Marcus and I played in bands together when we were kids because we went right through school together. So Marcus said to Tony when they got the band going that he really wanted to get me in. So yeah, for us, we do feel like brothers. We argue like brothers, but we also have that sort of level of respect for each other that goes way beyond just sort of blokes in a band,
Yeah, well, and that's kind of led me into this question, because I've never been in a band before, so forgive me if I'm totally talking out of my ass right now, but I'd imagine that having three guys who know each other and go each other way back, that's almost kind of have to make the songwriting process a little bit more organic, right?
Yeah, I think so. There's definitely, you hear terms like, people talking about bands having chemistry. We're getting on, so we've played in a lot of bands together. Marcus and I, especially, since Marcus and I played in a band together when we were 15. So for us, we know what it's like when you feel real true chemistry when you play with other people. And the first rehearsal that we had, we just knew straight away that there was it felt like we'd been playing together for 10 years. So we just knew from the get-go we had something that really felt like something to us. Whether or not other people were going to get onto it didn't really matter to us. We just knew that we had to do something. So, yeah, I think the first album we wrote in 6 months, we just holed up in a rehearsal space, and even though me and Tony were working, we were rehearsing till 2 a.m, then going to work, and it never felt like a chore. And we, wrote the first 12 songs in 6 months and went straight into the studio and did them. So everything has felt organic from the start, really.
Yeah, that's awesome. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that Marcus was in a band called Looking Glass, and you were in a band called Armored Angel at one point, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Looking Glass only finished sort of a few years back. When we started, Marcus had both bands going. But I think Marcus just felt that he wanted to go in a slightly different direction. Like Looking Glass are a lot kind of, I don't know how I'd describe it. They're a lot busier, I suppose. Like Tony and I, as a rhythm section, are a lot more simplistic and probably more straight metal or hard rock based, whereas Looking Glass were a lot more sort of, they were a lot more sort of technical players,
Yeah. Well, was maybe like does any of like Marcus's past experiences or your past experiences in Armored Angel, does that at all play a role into like how you contributed to the sound of Witchskull, or are you going into this with like a completely clean slate?
Look, we spoke about making sure we didn't want to, because Marcus was the singer and guitarist in Looking Glass, we said we didn't want to be just another version of Looking Glass. But it was apparent pretty quickly that because Tony and I, as a rhythm section, play a lot more straight and a lot more simplistic and base it more on groove, that it sounded pretty different. For us, groove's a big thing. That's why we write all of our songs from jams, whereas Looking Glass didn't do that. So I think naturally things sound to me more organic if they come from jams as opposed to just bringing full completed songs to the rehearsal room.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I was really curious about, I always ask drummers this, but like do you need like music before you lay down the rhythm section and start laying down your parts, or do you sometimes have a whole pattern laid down and maybe the band would write over that?
No, we normally just start, we literally just, to do a line check for levels in the rehearsal room, I just start playing and those guys sort of come in, and then most of the time we sort of jam for sort of 10 minutes, and if something starts coming, we stop and address it and say maybe go into this, and then just move forward that way. So it's always organic, or someone will just say, hey man, I've got a riff, what do you reckon of this? And then we just all jump in and just start playing it and just see where it goes.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by drums, even though I can't keep a beat to save my life. But I've always found drums fascinating because when you listen to a riff, how do you know, okay, I have to sustain the ride cymbal over here, or I have to use a crash cymbal here. Okay, it's bass drum here and snare here. Like, how exactly do you know when you listen to the riffs what to play, pretty much? There's so much stuff.
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest. I've never really thought about it. I think you just kind of, if you let yourself, once you're sort of in that sort of situation when you're jamming stuff out, you don't think. You just more allow things to sort of happen as you feel them. And that's what I tend to do. Like, I always make sure that we do like a pre-production demo before we do an album so that I can hear my parts back. A lot of the time, my kick drum gets lost in rehearsals, so sometimes the first time I hear everything back clearly is on a demo, and then if I know that works, then I'll take those parts exactly as they are into the studio. I tend to prefer to work like that, and I know Tony does, whereas Marcus is a lot more spontaneous. On the last two albums, not so much this one, all of the leads were just done off the cuff, so he just naturally just rolls with it. But yeah, Marcus is a pretty exceptional player. Yeah. I don't think I could just wing it like that.
Yeah, I don't understand when it comes to drums. Like, I feel like it's not only just the most difficult instrument, as in, the famous saying, your drummer sucks, your band sucks. In a way, I'm sure you've heard that before.
I have.
Yeah, but because it also is like you have to keep the rhythm and keep the beat. Okay, but I feel like it's also the mixing of it is also got to be the most clean cut, because if it's too over the vocals, but you also don't want it too under because it's going to sound out of time. It just seems like every difficult aspect of playing music is always in the drums.
Look, I think there's a little extra pressure on the drummer, and obviously because I'm the drummer, I'm probably a bit biased, but there's just an additional pressure that's kind of the bed rock of everything. So it's kind of, if you get that wrong, then it's very hard to build the rest of the album around, because if you've got really poor sort of drum parts, the rest of the album's never going to be as good as it could have been. So there's definitely a slightly added pressure with that. But we record very organically. We play everything live. We don't use click tracks. So there's definite movement within the track. So if you hear them back, we try to be as well rehearsed as we can. But if you listen back, there's always kind of elements of what you would call mistakes. But for us, that's the era we grew up in. It's more about the actual feel and the groove of the take, as opposed to the technicality or the perfection of it. And it's one of the things that we all have a bit of an issue with as we're getting older is I don't know where the obsession with precision came from, because precision isn't music, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Precision is just, you want to get it as right as you can, but it shouldn't be the be-all and end-all. Well, not to me anyway.
Yeah, of course. And I remember, though, one of my favorite quotes is when Rob Zombie was on Joe Rogan's podcast. He says the original idea for White Zombie was, let's never use conventional drum beats, which is the equivalent of saying, let's never make the songs fun for people to listen to. So...
Yeah, look, you're not going to hear anything particularly different from me, but that's the kind of drummer I am and the background that I came from. So, look, my favourite drummer of all time is Phil Rudd from AC/DC. So I could never even hope to be on the same level as that guy, but it's just the way he focuses on groove over everything else, and he plays slightly behind the beat, which means the snare hits, if it was against a metronome, the snare hits just before the actual metronome hit would be, and when you play slightly behind the beat, I think things tend to swing and groove a bit more. So there's just that's what I sort of focus on more with the drummer, what the groove's like, as opposed to how technical someone is. As good as Neil Peart was in Rush, and he's like one of the greatest ever, like it's far more technical than I sort of like to listen to, because I prefer stuff to just be really sort of primal and just a bit more sort of rough and ready,
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say when it comes to making the music, you try to capture a moment in a way.
Yeah, definitely. And simplicity for us too, We always say the song is king, so it's not about people sort of, adding things for the sake of it. We always say if something you bring to the table enhances the song, then it'll make it. But if it doesn't enhance the song and it's just there to sort of then, show what you can do, then we tend to sort of shy away from that. We try to be as organic as we can, because just not hearing that sort of organicness in as much in modern music. So, and just because we're older, it's just what we like. So we figured we're just going to do what we like doing, and if people jump on board, that's great. But we're not too bothered if they don't.
Yeah. Well, do you find that maybe like the longer you work on a song, the harder it is to kind of maintain that moment in a way?
Yeah, definitely. Some songs, for whatever reason, like there was a song called Son of the Snake on our second album, the last one, and that just, it took a long time to write, but the reason it took a long time is we try to never force the arrangement. We tend to just kind of keep playing it and then slowly tweak it. But that was written over, that song probably took about 18 months before we finally realised, we've played it the same way for about 3 times now, so it must be finished. Whereas other songs like Raven off the last album, the first track, I think was written in sort of 15 minutes. So it comes down to a lot of the time a groove, but then it comes down to what Marcus gets melody-wise. If he comes up with a good singing line, that's the stuff I really focus on, and if it's a really good singing line, we tend to kind of try and work that song up,
Fair enough. I guess, like, you always, I feel like when you start laying down stuff to capture a moment, every time you go back to it, it represents that, so it might be easy to kind of pick off from there.
Yeah, that's a hard thing because I think people outside the band only hear the version that's on the record, but I'm presuming probably every version that's on the record is never as good as some of the versions you've played in the rehearsal space, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So when it comes to the studio, especially bands of our, where there's limited time and, the budgets aren't massive, you have to you kind of have to roll with it. But we do that by just trying to be as loose as we can in the studio, and just kind of try not to focus or get stressed out, And
Yeah.
Marcus has helped me with that. He's always been a believer of, just treat it like a rehearsal. Whatever comes out, comes out. That's the thing with a record. It's an actual record of a moment in time. It's a snapshot of where you were at that moment as a band. So if you think like that, it doesn't really matter how things turn out.
Yeah, of course. You ready for the most difficult question of the interview?
Okay.
All right, because I noticed that A Driftwood Cross is just under 6 minutes long, but then you have a song like this Silent Place that's just under 4 minutes, and then Baphomet's Child that's 3 minutes. How do you know when a song is done?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and the way we've worked it out as a band is when it feels right, and we think the longer you rehearse a song and don't try to end it, it naturally feels right. So songs like A Driftwood Cross, it used to be shorter, but it just never felt right, and we knew that there was something missing. And the actual riff that comes in where Marcus sings A Driftwood Cross, that was the missing piece to the puzzle. So although we kept playing the song without that part, we knew the song wasn't finished because it needed something, but we didn't know what. And then when Marcus finally brought that riff in, and came up with that singing line, we knew once that bit came in, sort of as a bridge or chorus sort of section, we knew it was done as soon as that sort of that part came in. So we just think we always say let the songs breathe. So as we write them, we just wait until they arrange themselves, until we've played it for long enough where we just know it's right.
Yeah, I love that saying, let the songs breathe. That's a very good saying right there.
Yeah, we use it all the time. We always say things like, focus on letting the songs breathe, and also another big one for us is just less is more, I think a lot of the time, I definitely try to do that with drums, and I know Tony does with bass. And same as Marcus, when we're just all together playing the rhythm sections, a lot of the time it's really simple, but playing simple and solid and keeping it all together, the more you do that as a band, the better it ends up sounding when you do it.
Definitely. And the final question I wanted to ask you is, I've actually interviewed quite a bit of bands from Australia, such as, Neo Bliviscaris and Thy Art Is Murder, and a bunch of other bands of many different styles. Your area of Australia, in Canberra, is that like, is there kind of like a scene out there that you're currently active in? Is there like a lot of metal bands, or do you prefer to play in like bigger cities? Like I heard like Sydney's very different from like Melbourne or something like that.
Yeah, look, there is a good scene in Canberra. There always has been, and it's pretty eclectic. There's a lot of different stuff going on. Look, my favourite band in Australia is from Canberra as well, Hellbringer. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're kind of like an old school black and thrash kind of band. And I'm actually good mates with those guys, so them for me are probably the highlight of the band, probably the best, one of the best bands to ever come out of Canberra for me. And then there's other guys like a band called Pod People, who were big in the doom scene sort of, 20 years back or so. They've only just reformed. There was a band called I Exist that have recently disbanded. Members of that have formed Mental Cavity. So there's a lot of really good sort of band. They're sort of more of a hardcore band. So for us, we sort of try to just play shows with bands, with people that we know and like, as opposed to stylistically. I personally prefer to mix genres up at shows because I just think it's more interesting for everyone, as opposed to just having one style and just clubbing people with 5 bands of the exact same genre,
Absolutely. I could not agree more.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Just the other part of your question was, we play. Melbourne's probably the mecca, definitely the mecca of music in Australia. It's always had the strongest and best pub scene, and we play Sydney a lot because it's very close, and it's only sort of 3 hours drive up the road for us, which is very short in Australian terms. Melbourne's about 7 or 8 hours drive, but we can still do that in a weekend, you know. So we mainly only play between Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra just because of the size of the country. But we've played Brisbane a couple of times and 2 trips to New Zealand now. New Zealand's amazing. That's like that seems like something else.
Yeah, New Zealand. I just listened to the new Ulcerate album, that doom band, that death and doom metal band from New Zealand, and Alien Weaponry's from New Zealand. New Zealand, they're calling it I heard somebody call it like the Sweden of the Pacific at the moment.
Yeah, well, mate. Look, we're good friends with a band called Beast Wars, and they're one of the best live bands on the planet. They do a festival called Obey the Riff every year in Wellington in New Zealand, and we're invited over for the last one in March, just gone, and they were absolutely stunning. So they've brought us over a couple of times now, so we've toured with them twice, and brilliant people, but what a band. Hopefully they're planning they were planning to head off to Europe this year for the first time, I think, and unfortunately with everything that's going on, that's been put on hold.
Yeah, well, that led me to, before we go, is there just anything with the album, the new album, which is A Driftwood Cross, is scheduled to come out this Friday? Is there just anything else that you would like to promote that isn't at the risk of getting canceled thanks to a virus that shall not be named?
Yeah, look, for us at the moment, it's just a case of we don't make a living from the band, so for us, we're pretty lucky. So I guess the last message would be our best wishes go out to all the people in the industry that are unable to work and unable to make a living at the moment, and we wish them all of the best. And with any luck, we've played. Our only show we've ever played overseas was in New York at St. Vitus Bar when we recorded the last album in Brooklyn. So New York holds a very sort of big place in our heart because our bass player Tony's from Queens. So we hope to be back in New York City when things chill out, hopefully to tour on this album.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much. Everybody, we are here with Witchskull, A Driftwood Cross, out this Friday. Buy it then while supplies last forever, and we'll see you next time on Heavy New York.